Good morning, everybody. Welcome back to the channel. I'm Brittany Morgan, and let's get into this New Zealand versus Canada comparison. Some background on me is that I've lived in Canada for over 30 years in between Ottawa and Calgary, so the eastern and the western part of Canada. I've also lived in New Zealand for the past 9 months, traveling all around the country and experiencing life in different cities. I'm definitely not an expert in living in either country, but I thought it'd be fun to put together some of my different opinions on some topics that might be of interest to you if you're looking to move to either place. So let's get started with the weather. Canada is cold in the winter. I mean, there are parts of Canada that only really get rain, specifically the west coast, but for the most part, Canada gets really, really cold and snowy in the winter months. I'm talking -30, -40 degrees Celsius for a few weeks at a time. If we're talking about Calgary specifically, sometimes those winters last 6 months. Canadian summers can also be extremely hot and humid depending on where you are in the country. In inland southern British Columbia or in Ontario, you can get temperatures above 40 degrees Celsius with 100% humidity. Canada is definitely a country of extremes when it comes to temperature. It goes way up, it goes way down. So you really have to be prepared for this. You have to have tons of different gear for the winter, heavy jackets, heavy boots. And like I mentioned, depending on where you are in Canada, the climate can be completely different. The East Coast and the West Coast have totally different climates. And depending on what you like and what you prefer, the West Coast might be the best option for you. And if you don't mind the cold, maybe somewhere like Calgary will be okay. And of course, Canada is in the northern hemisphere, which means we have winter in December, summer in June, and the southern hemisphere, New Zealand, has the opposite. So that means we're going into December right now. That is the beginning of summer. New Zealand definitely wins in this category for me. It's just much more mild and temperate. New Zealand truly has 4 separate seasons. You'll get an actual spring for a few months, an actual summer for a few months, a fall and a winter. The winters in New Zealand can get a bit cold on the South Island, but we're talking like maybe up to -5, -10 degrees Celsius, and a little bit of snow here and there. Particular parts of the South Island will get a lot of snow, especially in the mountains, but it's usually not in places that people live, and it doesn't stick around for months and months. Coming from Canada, a New Zealand winter is absolutely perfection. It's easy peasy, and you can absolutely be outside all year round here. New Zealand, again, is a pretty long country, and depending on where you are, it's going to have its own microclimate. If you're going to be up somewhere like Auckland, it's going to be a little more mild and wet than somewhere down south like Dunedin. But overall, New Zealand has a much more agreeable climate, and it's just easier to live and be outside. The one thing I will mention that is a downside of being in New Zealand in terms of weather is that the sun is incredibly strong here. You can do your own research as to why it is that way, but the sun is incredibly strong in New Zealand, and it really doesn't feel like anywhere else. Even if you're in the middle of spring, let's say, and it's 19 degrees, if you're full on in the sun and there isn't a breeze, it's gonna feel like it's 30+ degrees. It's super strong. You really need to be careful and wear sunscreen at all times, or you're gonna risk getting skin cancer or a pretty severe burn. Both countries have risks of natural disasters depending on where you are. Back home in Alberta, we get a lot of wildfires. BC also gets a lot of pretty intense wildfires that spread all summer long, evacuate towns for months on end, and it can get really nasty outside to the point where you can't even be outside because the air quality is so low. Flooding as well can be common in certain parts of Canada in the rainy months. And then, of course, you get huge blizzards, freezing rain, and all the horrible things that winter comes with. In New Zealand, at least since we've been here, there's been cyclones, there's been flooding, crazy flooding. And I think the risk of a tsunami is pretty big in certain areas because earthquakes can be common in parts of the country. So no matter which way you go, you're gonna have to deal with some kind of natural weather event in both places. The next item on this list I wanted to talk about is cost of living. This is very dependent on where you're living in both countries. Let's start with Canada. So if you're going to be living somewhere like Toronto or Vancouver, yeah, it's going to be insanely expensive, especially if you want to buy property. Rent is also going up like crazy all across Canada, and I would say it's pretty comparable to places like Auckland. Let's compare two cities of similar population, Calgary in Canada and Auckland in New Zealand. If you want to buy a home in Auckland, your median price is 1.04 million New Zealand dollars, which translates to 865,000 Canadian. And this is for a standard detached home. To get the same thing in Calgary, Canada, you're looking at 635,000 Canadian dollars, which translates to 763,000 New Zealand dollars. So you can see it's quite a bit more expensive to buy a detached home in Auckland. When we talk about rent in both cities, you're looking at $670 a week, which translates to about $2,400 a month Canadian in Auckland. We go by month in Canada, they go by week in New Zealand, if you didn't know that. And in Calgary, you're looking at $2,100 a month Canadian, which works out to about $580 a week New Zealand dollars. And that's for a 2-bedroom apartment. So again, it is more expensive to live in Auckland, and chances are you're probably going to be making less money in New Zealand compared to Canada. When it comes to cost of rent and buying a house, if you would compare Auckland to somewhere like Vancouver, I think it would end up being pretty comparable. I found that grocery prices in New Zealand when we first moved here were way more expensive than what we were used to in Canada. Now, in the last few months, I have noticed that it's gone down pretty significantly, especially with certain things going into season. The prices have radically dropped. But there are still some items, specifically like eggs, that still go for $1 an egg. So a little 6-pack of eggs is gonna run you like $6 to $8 here. I would say our grocery bill at this point in time is quite comparable to what we were spending in Canada. So they're pretty much on a level playing field at this point. So overall, both countries are quite similar depending on what city you're going to live in. They are countries that it's going to be a lot easier if you make a lot of money. If you want to live somewhere rural and maybe work remote, you could probably make that work for you in either place. Now let's move into quality of life. After living in both countries, I think that the quality of life is quite comparable. Despite my not so great experience with the New Zealand healthcare system here, it does seem like residents or people who utilize the private sector get treated a lot better. So let me just go into this a little bit. If you didn't know, New Zealand has a mix of private and public healthcare. Canada only has public healthcare. So of course, this means that if you have a little bit of money, you're going to get better care. If you can't afford that though, there are extremely long wait times to see doctors or to just get into talk to anyone. If you have the most minor thing that you want to see a doctor about, it can be a 6+ hour wait, especially if you're not a citizen here. If you're more on the wealthy side and you have a good job and you make good money, New Zealand might edge out Canada in this category simply because you can pay for private healthcare here. This is a whole other topic that I'm not going to get into about how having private healthcare divides the rich and the poor, and it's just a whole other thing. We're really not going to get into that. I don't want to go on a rant on this, but it is an option in New Zealand. In Canada, it isn't. So depending on where you live, I have heard if you're not a citizen or a resident in Canada, healthcare is a lot worse, especially in cities like Toronto. Toronto is way overpopulated, and it's going to be an absolute nightmare to try to get help there. If you're moving somewhere like Calgary with a much lower population, it's probably going to be a lot easier. So again, it's so dependent on what city you're going to pick. Another item with quality of life is health concerns. Canada, well, it's really cold. It's hard to be outside certain parts of the year. It gets dark really early in both countries in the winter, but in Canada, you can't really go outside for that long. So it will affect your physical and mental health over those months. In New Zealand, even if it gets dark early, you can still go outside for a walk later in the evening or early in the morning because it's just not that cold where you're like risking your health being outside for more than a minute. Like I mentioned earlier, New Zealand has a super strong sun, so the risk of skin cancer is much, much higher here than anywhere else, and that's definitely something to keep in mind, especially if you're an outdoor enthusiast. Now let's talk about workplace situations in terms of quality of life. So Canada has a North American work ethic and pretty crappy vacation time. In Canada, you only get 2 weeks as a minimum and then all your regular statutory holidays on top of that. In New Zealand, you get a minimum 4 weeks of paid vacation. So hands down, New Zealand wins in this category for me. It's also not taboo to actually take vacation time in New Zealand. People are always open to taking like a month off at a time or to take a few months off to travel abroad, and that company will just temporarily fill your position while you're gone. In Canada, like you would get fired. You would just not have a job when you came back. If you were like, hey, I want to go and like travel for 3 months. Yeah, that's not going to happen in Canada. Like you're going to lose your career, you lose your job. So that is a huge downside to living in Canada if you want to be a world traveler and maybe take like mini retirements, let's call it, where you maybe spend like 6 months here and there going and exploring. There's a very, very, very small chance you're going to find an employer in Canada who will allow you to do that. Maybe if you're in like academia and you're really high up in your field or something where they can't afford to lose you, but that's just not really a thing back home. In New Zealand, they want you to take your vacation and they're planning their own vacation. Like North American work ethic means you're just like slaving away, working extra hours, not getting paid for it. It's like embarrassing if you're one of the first people to leave the office at the end of the day. Like if you're the last person to leave the office in North America, it's like you are the hardest working person, which makes absolutely no sense because if you can't get your job done in the 8 hours that you have at work, you're not efficient. Like, why is that getting applauded? In New Zealand, it can be a little bit harder to build net worth, to build wealth, unless you're one of the lucky few who gets a really, really, really good job. But because you're making less money and the cost of living is essentially the same as Canada, it's a little bit harder to build a nest egg to build for retirement. It's definitely harder to buy a home in New Zealand because the prices are higher. And again, with the factor of you're making less money than you would in Canada, that's a little tough if you want to build wealth. There's also a lot less people in New Zealand, a population of about 5 million compared to 40 million in Canada. So it can be difficult to find your people. It can be difficult to find friend groups who are actually going to let you in if you're moving from another country. There's just not as many people to mingle with, to meet, to connect with. That's another downside, I think, to living in New Zealand. And another downside of living in New Zealand is the she'll be right attitude. So this is essentially affects mental health the most. A lot of people here don't want to talk about their issues, don't want to talk about mental health. Taking time to go and recover from certain things, from certain traumas. Drinking culture here is very toxic. Yesterday in my time was something called a crate day, where you buy like a crate of beer of like, I don't know. I think it equates to like 13 liters of beer or something ridiculous. I'll put like an article here so you can see, and I'll link it below if you want to read more about it. But you have like from noon to midnight to drink all this alcohol, and the emergency rooms are like overwhelmed with people getting like alcohol poisoning and having their stomachs pumped and like getting into accidents and whatnot because the drinking culture here is so toxic. As someone who really doesn't drink, who's more on like the sober side of things, it just would be kind of hard, I think, to find a friends group here that wasn't revolved around alcohol and drinking. So that's something definitely to keep in mind. If you're someone who doesn't drink, it might be a little harder for you to feel like you fit in here. To summarize quality of life, I'm going to say that if you want to live in Canada, you're essentially giving up your time for more money. If you want to live in New Zealand, you're going to be making less money and have less wealth, but you're going to be living a more balanced and full life. It's much easier to buy a home in Canada, but you can definitely live a more modest life in New Zealand. You're not going to get as judged for having like a smaller house or not as nice of a car as you would in Canada. New Zealand doesn't really care about material things like that, where Canada, definitely in cities like Toronto and Vancouver, you're going to be judged if you're not keeping up with the Joneses. And there are pockets in Canada that are a little more open to, let's say, alternative lifestyles and not chasing money all the time, but it's just really rare to find. I think in New Zealand, if you're going to be raising a family and you really value time and nature and being out in the world more than building wealth, New Zealand is definitely the best choice. Let's talk about scenery. Of course, both countries are absolutely stunning. Such a diverse amount of landscapes and beautiful scenery all across both countries. You've got mountains, you've got oceans and beaches, wide open plains, huge forests, like you name it. Both countries pretty much have it. In New Zealand, it's a little more compact. You can go from like coast to coast in, 4 or 5 hours. In Canada, that's going to take you like 50, 60 hours to go coast to coast. So that's not a day trip. New Zealand does stand out a little bit in this category because it just has some of the most diverse and amazing landscapes so close to each other. So you'll have a place like Milford Sound with these massive mountains, and there's like glaciers in the area, and then the ocean is right there with all the wildlife. You don't really see that kind of stuff in Canada. Like, there are still gorgeous landscapes and you can still see wildlife and everything like that. But New Zealand just has a little bit of a unique thing going on. So many species here are endemic to the country and you can only see them in New Zealand. So that is pretty cool. And I think New Zealand wins just by like a hair on this one. Let's talk about travel to and from both places. So it probably goes without saying that Canada wins in this category simply because it is so much closer to all different parts of the world than New Zealand is. New Zealand is truly on its own in the middle of nowhere. Australia is your closest place to go and check out. Some of the South Pacific Islands too are a few hours flight away. But Canada borders the United States, which has a lot of amazing cities to go and visit. It's also very close to Europe if you're on the eastern part of Canada. There's a much higher chance that you're going to be able to find a really good flight deal out of a Canadian city, simply because it's much closer and there's many more people to serve. So you're just going to get the really good deals going to places like Europe or down to the US. The biggest thing though is that because vacation time in Canada is only 2 weeks, are you really going to have enough time to go to all these places where if you're in New Zealand, you've got 4 weeks and yeah, it's a longer flight, but have more time to actually see the world. So that's a bonus. So depends on what you value, I guess. To wrap this up, I'll say that both countries are really, really similar. They both have their pluses and their negatives. So you really have to sit down, figure out what cities specifically you're interested in and compare those directly because both countries are so diverse and so different depending on where you are. I'd say if you don't have family or friends tying you to either country, like if you're moving from a totally different country, this would be a really difficult decision. And it really comes down to, are you going to be able to survive winter in Canada? If you're not moving to like Vancouver, which is probably the most expensive city in Canada, it's going to be a really rough winter if you haven't been through that kind of weather before. And it's hard to get used to, honestly. There are many times every year that I struggle with it, and I was born there and raised there and went through many, many winters. It's a tough decision, I'm not gonna lie. If I did not have family and friends back in Canada, I think I might be leaning towards New Zealand. I don't know. I don't think either country wins overall. It really depends on what your values are and what you want to do with your life. So I hope this video was enjoyable for you guys. Leave me a comment down below if you have anything to add to this list. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you really soon in the next one. Bye.